Tonight on At Issue, we're focusing on question 3. Should rideshare drivers in Massachusetts have a legal path to form a union? Plus, 2 major newspapers choose not to endorse in the presidential race.
I see this as, a betrayal of the core principles of the Post.
What's behind those decisions? And with 7 days until Election Day, the 2 state party chairs join us live in the studio. At Issue starts now.
Good Tuesday evening and welcome to another live edition of At Issue. I'm Corey Smith.
And I'm Sue O'Connell. The campaign from the White House just has 7 days left to it. Tonight in Washington, Vice President Harris will make what her campaign is calling a closing argument. Upwards of 50,000 people could turn up at the Ellipse, according to the D.C. police.
That is near the White House, of course, and as we remember, on January 6, 2021, former President Donald Trump addressed a crowd there, encouraging people to march to the Capitol, shortly before it was violently attacked.
But we're going to start a little closer to home with Massachusetts ballot question number 3. Your vote will decide whether Uber and Lyft drivers would be allowed to unionize.
Now, a union means drivers could potentially engage in collective bargaining for wages, benefits, work conditions. NBC 10's Oscar Margame went for a ride to break it all down.
Hello, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
For Oscar?
How's it going? Yes, Price Hill?
Yes.
Yes, how you doing? How are you?
Good.
Ride-hailing in Massachusetts has undergone many changes for drivers recently, and this November, voters could further empower drivers at the ballot box. In June, Uber and Lyft reached a settlement with the state attorney general's office, which sued the companies in 2020, arguing that drivers are employees under the state law and entitled to basic benefits and protections. Now, the settlement kept the classification as independent contractors, and in return, it gave drivers a minimum wage of $32.50 an hour, accident insurance, paid sick leave, and stipends for health insurance and paid family leave, among other benefits. Roxana Rivera with 32BJ, a workers' union, says Massachusetts voters can take the next step and give these drivers the legal permission to form a union.
The recent settlement by the Attorney General was a start, but it didn't account for all the out-of-pocket costs that the drivers have for their car, for their maintenance, for their insurance.
Now, while a yes on question 3 would give riders the power to unionize and collective bargain, the counter argument here is that these companies could decide to raise the prices on the rides. Uber and Lyft sent us similar responses, saying that they have concerns with some of the language in the ballot, but they're not campaigning against it. If it is voted through, they will work with the legislature to make changes. Kelly Cobb with the Massachusetts Drivers United Group is a no on question 3, not because she does not want drivers to organize, but because the ballot doesn't go far enough.
This ballot initiative would maintain independent contractor status. Another issue for us does not include delivery drivers. All of those workers deserve to be classified as employees and entitled to all the benefits and protections.
Now, Kelly wishes that it would be up to the drivers to decide, so she is relying on Massachusetts voters to look closely at the language of the ballot before casting their vote.
The thing is that a lot of these people work at part-time, and I don't know if they get to be full-time if that's what they want.
Give them the union rights, and then if further down the line you decide, okay, it's too expensive, maybe not use it so much, and then maybe the companies will see, we're losing out.
So, Price, what do you think about question number 3? Do you support it?
Yes, totally. As a single driver, nobody will hear me. Nobody will hear my claims. Every other employee have that right but us.
So there you have it. This November, the choice is yours. A yes vote means that you'll make Massachusetts the first in the nation to allow drivers to unionize. A no vote would leave things just as they are. Oscar Margane, NBC 10 Boston.
All right, Oscar, thank you. So joining us to talk about question 3 are 2 people hoping that the yes side comes out on top come Election Day. Batania Gonell is a driver for Uber, and Mike Vertibedian is co-chair of the Yes on 3 committee and is a business representative of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers Union. Thank you both for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank
you for having us.
Batania, I use Uber a lot. My family, it's our second car, so we don't have to have a second car. I ask drivers all the time, what should I do when it comes to this question? question. Many of them tell me that they don't want it because they fear that's going to change their ability to make their own hours. What do you say to voters who are unsure about that part of the issue?
Okay. We are asking for vote yes on 3 because I'm a single mother. I have 2 kids. I've been doing Uber and Lyft for 10 years. And when I start doing Uber, I start working 40 hours a week. Now I have to work between 70 and sometimes even 80 hours a week. And I know drivers who work even 90 hours a week. And this is why we want the union. We don't have flexibility anymore. Flexibility means you work a regular schedule, 40 hours, but when you work 70 and 80 hours, you don't have flexibility anymore.
So, Mike, we know the Executive Council of the Massachusetts AFL-CIO voted to remain neutral here. Some union officials that NBC 10 spoke with worry that these unions would only be unions in name only. Some rideshare drivers may not actually have any say in the collective bargaining process. What do you make of those concerns and maybe those criticisms of voting yes here?
So, there's a lot of ideas around Uber and Lyft, and there's been a lot of ideas across the country. What we've been listening to is the drivers. We've been organizing drivers for years. 95% of them support question 3, and they're in desperate need of a voice in the workplace. They are making less and less of the fare each time, and when Uber and Lyft came in, they were getting probably 75-80% of the fare, and now they're down to 50 to 25%. So they need a voice in the workplace, and we've been listening to the drivers. And respect everything with all my partners in labor. We just all have the same idea in mind. We want everybody to have a voice in the workplace. We just all have different ways of doing it.
Mike, I've been through a lot of ballot question battles in my many years here. Usually there are 2 sides arguing with each other, buying a ton of ads and putting up a lot of billboards. We haven't really heard from Lyft or Uber on this issue. Some labor activists and specialists are saying that may mean that they just expect to tie this up in court if it passes. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I hope that's not the case, but what I believe is that right out the gate, that the polling was showing 2-1 in favor of this ballot initiative, and the drivers support 95% support this ballot initiative, as well as Attorney General Campbell's endorsement. I believe that it was a decision by Uber and Lyft to not politically take on such a large uphill battle.
But Tanya, Uber and Lyft drivers run the gamut, as you mentioned, single mom with 2 kids. Some are college kids trying to make a little extra money. When you have this sort of diverse group of folks, why do you think a union is best and being able to unionize is best for drivers who are very, very different?
Okay, we need the union, like I said. We need negotiation. We need a representation. We need somebody who can sit on the table with Uber and Lyft and talk about our work condition. We don't have problem just with the fare. The fare is the minimum, let's say. Our biggest nightmare is the deactivation. Uber can deactivate you anytime without any process. Imagine, I've been working for this industry for 10 years. If somebody have a complaint, tomorrow when I go online, I can be deactivated. What am I gonna do? And this is why we need the union. We need representation because we need negotiation. That is what we need.
All right.
95% of the driver are supporting the union.
All right, well, we will have to leave it there. Tanya Gunnell, Mike Vertabedian, thank you so much for joining us on that issue.
Thank you so much for having us.
We appreciate it. All right, for more on the ballot questions, all of them, you can scan the QR code right there on your screen. That's going to take you to our website, NBC10Boston.com, where we have a comprehensive guide on all 5 questions.
All right, we're going to turn to the presidential race and the practice of newspapers endorsing one candidate over the other.
This is a tricky dilemma for some journalists. Why should newspapers, which strive to be objective when covering news, allow their editorial page to endorse a candidate? Last week, the Washington Post changed its policy and announced it was not endorsing a presidential candidate, and that sparked a major backlash. Last Friday, the Washington Post's new CEO, William Lewis, announced the paper would not endorse Vice President Harris or former President Donald Trump. The Post has not always endorsed a presidential candidate, but in 12 of the last 13 elections, the editorial board has told the American public whom it believed deserved to be in the Oval Office. In his piece, Lewis said the Post was returning to what he called the newspaper's independent roots of not issuing an endorsement. The move was a surprise and led several members of the Post editorial board to resign in protest. Former executive editor Marty Barron said the timing of the announcement was troubling.
If this decision had been made 3 years ago, 2 years ago, a year ago, fine. But this was a decision that was announced 11 days before the election. It was not a decision made in consultation with the editorial board. It was a decision that, according to the Post itself, its own reporting, that was made by Jeff Bezos, and the circumstances are just highly suspect.
Editorial columnist Robert Kagan resigned, accusing the Post of kowtowing to the former president out of fear of what a second Trump term would mean for the paper and its billionaire owner, Jeff Bezos. Kagan noted that officials from Bezos' Blue Origin aerospace company met with Trump a few hours after the decision became public. Blue Origin has a multi-million-dollar contract with NASA, and the two men have butted heads in the past. But in an op-ed published Monday, Bezos argued that the move is a way to fight off perceptions of political bias, writing, "Presidential endorsements do nothing to tip the scales of an election. What presidential endorsements actually do is create a perception of bias, a perception of non-independence. Ending them is a principled decision, and it's the right one." So readers of the Post were not happy with the paper's decision. NPR is reporting that more than 250,000 people have canceled their subscriptions since last Friday. The Post wasn't the only paper where this issue came up. Last week, the online publication Semaphore reported that the owner of the Los Angeles Times, Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, blocked the paper from endorsing a candidate for president this year. USA Today and the 200-plus local publications under its umbrella will also not endorse a presidential candidate.
Locally, the Boston Globe did choose to endorse Vice President Harris. In that editorial, the Globe contrasted Harris's outlook for America with Donald Trump's, writing, quote, "His message is one of fear and loathing. Hers is one of unity, hope, and aspiration. Is the choice between those not clear?" End quote.
So joining us now is James Dowd, the Boston Globe editorial page editor, to talk about this. James, thank you so much for joining us. But before we get into this, I think this is a great moment for media literacy, because a lot of folks are finally learning about the dynamic between a newspaper's editorial board and its day-to-day staff in the newsroom. Can you explain what that dynamic is at the Globe?
Absolutely, and thanks for asking that question. It's key. And thank you for having me on. The editorial board is part of the opinion section, and the opinion section is a group of columnists, editors, editorial writers, and other kinds of journalists. And we are completely 100% separate from our newsroom. I do not report to the newsroom editor. I report directly to our chairwoman. And we do not coordinate on news. We do not discuss anything more than sort of, basic pleasantries, and we try to make sure we stay out of each other's way. So every decision made by the editorial board and the opinion section generally, every editorial we write, every endorsement we make is entirely independent of what the newsroom does.
Okay, so with that said, take us inside the editorial board conversations. Did you all have any conversations about not just which candidate you would endorse, but whether you would endorse a candidate at all?
Well, we did have a rather short-lived conversation about whether we should endorse at all. And that debate sort of circulated around the issue of Massachusetts being such a blue state and New England, by and large, being, very democratic by and large. We expect every state in our region to probably vote Democratic and give their electoral votes to Kamala Harris. But we got past that pretty quickly and decided it was important to take a stand in such an important election. And then we got down to talking about what we would say. There wasn't really any serious debate about whether we would endorse Harris. We knew we would. It became more a conversation about what would we say? What would we say that perhaps would be additive to voters who are, perhaps on the fence, or just who want to understand more about how this race is shaping up.
Jim, another thing that's complicated for folks to understand, because it also differs from newspaper to newspaper, and many folks looking at the Washington Post, you know, they say, well, Jeff Bezos, he was the reason why the Post didn't endorse, right? But in some places, the publisher is very involved, or the owner is very involved in what happens in the editorial room. So I'm asking, you know, what sort of conversations did you or the editorial board have with John Henry and Linda Pizzuti Henry, who are the CEO of Boston Globe Media?
Well, Linda is a member of the board, and we send all our editorials, whether they're about an endorsement, whether they're about a tax issue, whether it's about Boston Public Schools, every editorial is sent to them for them to know what we're saying. And they do participate in our conversations sometimes. This is how most editorial boards work. They report to their publisher or to the owner. Very often, major endorsements and major editorial positions are signed off on by the publisher or the owner. And in this case, we sent it to Linda and John to make clear that, A, we were going to endorse. They said, great. And then we sent them the actual text, and they approved it. And that was the extent of the conversation. And that's kind of how it typically goes. And I'm grateful that they gave us the support on this, and that they have always been sort of served as really just sort of smart readers of our editorials, and not in a highly intrusive way.
So, Jim, we got about 30 seconds left. What do you say to those journalists out there, the readers, the viewers who are asking, why do papers endorse anyway? Their goal is to be objective in the news that they report. So have endorsements maybe outlived their purpose? What do you say to that?
Well, it's a good debate, and one that I'm sure lots of papers are still having, and we may yet have in the future. But because we're the opinions section, it's our job to have opinions. It's our job to take positions. That's what we do. That's what our columnists do. That's what our editorials do. And we feel that even if you disagree with us, our writing and editorial can help you understand an issue more clearly. Even if it's to, it may not change your mind, but it may get you to think and crystallize exactly what your own views of an issue are. And that's why we do them. That's why we make endorsements. That's why we write editorials. And we do it separately from the newsroom. So they are about fair and objective reporting. We are about making arguments. And we encourage people to disagree with us. But that's what we do for a business.
All right. James Dow, the Boston Globe editorial page editor. James, we appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, here's the question. In 7 days, will former President Trump's political career be over or be reborn?
We have two people who will give us a precise answer to that question. Not really. Democratic Party Chair Steve Kerrigan, Republican Party Chair Amy Carnevale. They join us next. Stay with us.
And as we go to break, this is a live look at Washington, D.C., where Vice President Kamala Harris is addressing a crowd on the ellipse. Let's listen in.
On day one, and on day one, if elected, Donald Trump would walk into that office with an enemies list. When elected, I will walk in with a to-do list.
There are just 7 days left until Election Day. Let's talk with two people who have had their eyes and ears on the ground pretty much all year. Steve Kerrigan, the chairman of the Massachusetts Democratic Party, and Amy Carnevale is the state Republican Party chairperson. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
All right, let's talk about the presidential race, but we're a local politics show here at our core. So how do the events of last week involving former President Trump, his former chief of staff, saying he's a fascist, that he wanted generals like Hitler? Then there was the rally at Madison Square Garden in New York City that featured a number of speakers who made racist, insulting comments about a number of groups, chief among them Puerto Rico. Steve, I want to start with you. How does all of that play out at the local level for candidates and their staff in local races?
Look, our candidates, and first, thanks for having us, and thank you, Amy, for all you do for your party. local candidates are going to focus on what's important to win elections. We're trying to block out the noise, as we have been trying to do for 9 years since he went down that golden elevator, or escalator rather, of Donald Trump, because that's frankly not what the people of Massachusetts care about. His values aren't Democratic values, they're not Massachusetts values. And so folks here in Massachusetts are focused on how we can build a stronger economy, how we can protect people's reproductive freedom, and how we can build a stronger, safer America, which is what, by the way, Kamala Harris is focused on in the presidential race. So we're going to keep our eyes on the ball. He gives lots of he calls it the weave. I call it utter confusion. But he's trying to keep everybody on the move and distracted. By the way, what you saw at that Madison Square Garden thing was not a joke. It was not hyperbole, none of that stuff. It was a racist insult to Americans who live in Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican Americans who live all across this country. And he should not be allowed to get away with it by saying nothing about it. And his running mate shouldn't be allowed to get away with it by saying it's a simple joke.
Amy, the impact on local races, are you seeing anything out there?
Yeah, so first I want to denounce the comments that were made at Madison Square Garden. At no respect does that reflect the view of the Republican Party here in Massachusetts or Republicans. That being said, I do think that voters here in Massachusetts do tend to be focused on local issues. And those issues, number one, is the migration crisis, and number two is the economy. And we see them as linked. The migration crisis is, we now know that in the Commonwealth, we're spending over $1 billion a year to house and feed our migrants. And people in Massachusetts are feeling the economic consequences of that. So those are the number one and two issues that we see with voters.
We also know, by the way, that Donald Trump's economic plan is going to cost, at least according to the Tax Foundation, 1.4 million jobs in this country, and every American family on average about $4,000 a year. And so, look, yes, we are focused on the economy. By the way, when he does mass deportations, which by some estimates could cost $100 billion to get rid of 12 million Americans, we're also going to have the trickle-down effect on jobs in our communities and costs for everyday Americans. And so it's easy to say Republicans are focused on the migrant crisis and on the economy, but their solutions aren't focused on anything.
So I just jump in to say, what we talk to voters about is, were you better off under the Trump administration, or are you better off in the Biden administration? And, almost unanimously, we hear the economy was better in the Trump administration.
I love it when people say that, because this week, 4 years ago, 6.9% unemployment. There were folks with bowls of candy out in front of their houses because it was unsafe for people to hand things out. There is no metric by which you were better off 4 years ago under Donald Trump than you are right now under Joe Biden.
All right, so let's move on, Sue.
So, Amy, I want to ask, because this is the hard part. Every day I'm on with Corey, and once a day or so, Corey says, okay, if you were Trump's campaign manager, what would you be telling him to do? And I say, talk about the economy, talk about immigration, talk about inflation, and then something like the New York rally happens. And I can't imagine how his campaign managers feel. How do you stay focused on the values of the Republican Party when it comes to things you're talking about right now, when you have to start every conversation with, I denounce what the head of our party said?
So first, it was not the head of our party who said that. But I would say, we do stay focused on the issues here in Massachusetts, and those are the issues that we're hearing from people on the ground. So we're not hearing about Trump very much when we're going out campaigning, because we're hearing about those issues that are, the pocketbook issues that voters care about. So, that's how we're responding.
Do Democrats run the risk of overblowing this threat to democracy argument that they're making and not focusing on the economy, immigration?
I think you'll hear tonight from the vice president. The former president's focused on an enemies list. She's focused on a to-do list, which focuses on providing economic opportunity for folks in terms of $50,000 opportunity for small businesses, $25,000 opportunity for home ownership, 3 million new homes. She is child credit, tax credits, child care assistance. She is focused, by the way, on real freedoms, not the freedoms that Donald Trump talks about: reproductive freedom, freedom for civil rights and for equal rights, freedom for LGBTQ rights. And so we're not just focused on the threat to democracy, although Donald Trump is one. We're focused on what we will do once Kamala Harris is president of the United States.
Amy, very quickly,
yeah,
what can we pick up? What do you think you're going to pick up here in Massachusetts, Republican night? Very quickly.
Thank you. So we're looking to pick up seats in the state Senate here in Massachusetts and hold our own or pick up seats in the state House as well.
All right. Amy Carnevale, Steve Kerrigan, guys, thank you so much. Enjoy election night. We'll be there watching with you. All right, that is going to do it for this live edition of At Issue. Tomorrow, Massachusetts AG Andrea Joy Campbell is going to be here to talk about her efforts for the vice president's campaign and election security concerns.
Then we're going to take a deep dive on question 4. Should certain psychedelics be legalized? Eliza Dushku and her husband, Peter Palaginian, will join us to talk about how they transformed her life.
All right, that is going to do it for Sue O'Connell. I'm Corey Smith. Have a good night. We'll see you tomorrow.